Hey friends, it's Gloria and welcome back to another video. I'm going to talk about my 2025 favorite reads. Books that I read in 2025, not that were necessarily published in 2025. It wasn't the best reading year overall. I'm very stingy with my ratings. A lot of these were even in the 4-star range, but mostly positive historical fiction reads, which is what I wanted from 2025, so at least I got that. And I have a couple random little honorable mentions as well, and I'll just talk about some reading themes that came up throughout the year as I talk about some of these books. Let's start off with a book that I read in January of 2025, and it is wonderful. It was a beautiful epistolary novel. It is a novel fully told through diary entries and some letters, and it is Marmee, a novel of Little Women by Sarah Miller. I think you have to read Little Women and like Little Women in order to really appreciate the story. Otherwise, why would you care about the matriarchal mother figure in Little Women if you don't necessarily care about the original classic or don't really have any care with the movies or anything like that? But I loved this as an accompaniment and in addition to the classic. I think this is one of my favorite things about finding a beloved classic and then finding books that are retellings or spins on it, because it adds more to it. It expands my love and imagination for the original story that was written usually hundreds of years ago, and then an author in a contemporary time period in their voice pays homage to the original classic, and this was so beautifully told. I loved reading from the perspective of this strong woman, this mom who loves her girls fiercely. We get to know some of her backstory and history that the author imagines for her, which we don't necessarily get in the original classic, but some things are alluded to, and I loved every single minute of this. It was a fantastic audiobook, but also probably would be a great read, as it is, like I said, journal entries with the date written. Some of them are short, some of them are longer. This woman also experiences a lot of tragedy and loss and heartbreak, and again, just being in her headspace of who she is. I loved it. Loved it. It was a perfect, beautiful read, and if this is at all on your radar and you haven't read it yet, please do so. It was wonderful and it's perfect for a wintry read. Another wintry read, this whole series swept me away, and I didn't love the whole thing through and through, but this 3-book series gripped me and gripped my heart in a way that hasn't happened in a long time, and that is The Bronze Horseman by Polina Simons. I read this first book, which is a beast of a book, and there's so much to it, and then it continues on in the second book, which I have, and then a third book. Third book wasn't my favorite out of the series, but this first book was a journey and a ride, and it was an epic saga of a book. I think I originally compared this to an Outlander type of reading experience, which Outlander by Diana Gabaldon is one of my favorite books. They're not similar in time period or anything like that, but there are similar themes of really epic love and really intense love story that brings two people together, but then also war and tragedy and things trying to tear these characters apart and a lot of drama. But I did really appreciate the historical aspects of this book so much. This, I can say, I haven't read a lot, but out of all of the books that I've read that are set in Russia or have to do with Russia, have to do with World War II in Russia, in Leningrad or Moscow or wherever, most of the time these historical fiction novels that are set in Russia are written by Americans, which I get, and there's just something missing. I'm come from a Russian culture, and if you're not part of it, you just don't get it until you read something and you're like, thank you for just like making it make sense and making it real. And this author's family came from Russia. I think part of her family still lives in St. Petersburg, I don't know if now, but so it was very Russian through it all, and very accurate in a lot of the ways these people talked and interacted with one another, and it was an epic story. Did I even give you the premise? The main premise is it's a love story between a young woman named Tatiana and a man named Alexander. He is a Russian soldier and she is this young woman, and the main course of this book happens during the siege of Leningrad, when Leningrad is surrounded by the German army and people are starving to death. And so it is a story of survival through the war. It's a story of this romance that is pretty messy and complicated because there's a love triangle going on, which is a little bit meh, and I didn't love that part of it, and it was like overly dramatic in a lot of ways, and I'm like, just talk to each other and just tell each other the truth. And there's also a much too long for me honeymoon sequence that kind of also gave off like Outlander vibes. It's like, okay, we're gonna go there for a long time and many chapters, but I was thoroughly swept up in this beautiful story through and through, and it is an intense story. Like I said, if you're in it for the whole trilogy, it's an emotional roller coaster, but it also is a semi like realistic and beautiful one of coming together and forgiveness and fighting for each other and fighting for your love and coming up against everything that the world throws at you. But I thought that this was brilliant in a lot of ways, and it'll be very memorable for me in many years to come, even though there was a lot of things I didn't love about the whole story. It wasn't perfect, but it was definitely a standout read for me this year. And I think I would recommend for those that love an epic, sweeping historical fiction saga, a really deep, rich romance, and a lot of drama, because this book has a lot of drama, and also does not shy away from like very intense war, sadness, tragedy as well. So there's all that for you. I read quite a bit of romance this year. Another historical romance that was quite opposite from the Bronze Horseman. It was very innocent and very sweet and very wholesome. When I look at this book, I think about like, you know, 14 to 16-year-old Gloria, and I would recommend for like a teenage young girl that wants to read a sweet romance story, and it's just so precious. This is it. Edenbrooke by Julianne Donaldson. It is a proper romance, and it's very, like, there's just a kiss in it, but it was so sweet. It just brought all of the little butterflies. It made my heart happy. This is a story of a young woman, I believe she's 18. She gets invited by her twin sister to go to this country estate, and she thinks, okay, great, I'm just gonna like relax and get to read and just trollop through the countryside. I'm not really interested in anyone, don't want any unwanted suitors, kind of like Elizabeth Bennet vibes. But then her plans go awry when the heir to the estate and her start developing a friendship and real fondness for one another, and it was just a precious read. Definitely a highlight of the year. I read a few more, particularly in the summer, that were promised to be like this proper kind of romance style, and none of them have even come close to the vibes of this story. Another highlight of my reading year is definitely going through the Emma M. Lyon series. I first heard about this percolating in 2024, and I was always kind of confused about like, what are people reading? What is this series about? These diary entries from this girl, I thought the covers were weird, like it just is a random pastel color. But then I read them all, and I get the hype, and I understand the love and devotion to these books. The super sad part is that I believe the author intends for this to be a 23 or 24 book series, and there's only 8 of them, and it takes her about 2 years to write every one. So like, how long is the series gonna go on for? Much prefer to have a series be complete so that I can binge it all and be done and not worry about it and wait years and years and years. But the premise is also quite wholesome, quite sweet. Found family. We have a woman living in the Victorian time period in London in this kind of small community, the street. She lives with her cousin Archibald in this flat, and she gets a flatmate that rents out some space from her, and she develops this friendship with him and a duke and a vicar in the town. And there's just, again, this found family friendship development. There's a lot of like silly characters in this town and escapades and adventures that these people go through. It's sometimes like just silly fun adventure and random, and then there's a lot of depth at the same time, and there's this very wholesome, budding butterflies in your tummy romance as well that is developed throughout these 8 books so far, and it's a good time. I like totally get the hype, I get the love. I would highly recommend. The audiobooks were fantastic. I believe they're all available on Kindle Unlimited for those that read it that way. But yeah, these were a lot of fun, and I will definitely be eagerly awaiting the 9th book whenever that comes out. A couple other historical fictions that the romance is not the point of the book, but they did have a little bit of a romance subplot, which I think partially why I was in such a romance mood in 2025 made me love these stories even more. But again, they weren't at all the point of the book and were not the overwhelming story, and they were still really good. The first one I'll talk about is The Jackal's Mistress by Chris Bajalian. This is the first of his books that I've read that came out in 2025, and he's a very prolific author with tons of books, and I think a lot of them maybe like hit or misses. So if you've read from this author and you've loved another one of his books, please let me know where I should go next. But this is a true story, based on a true story, about a woman who lives in the South during the Civil War. Her husband is a Confederate soldier that's off to fight, but she hasn't heard from him in years, so he's maybe presumed dead. The book kicks off with a Yankee soldier who's severely wounded, ends up like hiding or showing up to her property after a battle. Instead of turning him in or killing him or just letting him die, she decides to rehabilitate him along with the people that live on her farm slash plantation, decides to help him get back to the North across enemy Confederate lines and save his life essentially. And she becomes this kind of like strong, badass woman. And so that's the main thing, and there is a bit of a romance subplot between these two characters, which is a very morally gray line for me and not something that I'd love to read about in books when these people are married. But again, it wasn't the main point or very overwhelming or very long in the book. It just was essentially a survival story, a story of planning of how were we going to accomplish this mission that we've set out to do and take care of one another against the odds of everything going on in the Civil War. Like I said, based on a true story of two people that came together and these events happened, but without the romance subplot as far as the author knew. But I appreciated the author's note, and I thought this was a really good story. And I haven't read too many about the Civil War, but I really enjoyed this one. Another super solid historical fiction that stood out for me this year was One Good Thing by Georgia Hunter. This is also a story of war and survival, World War II, set in Italy. We follow two main young women that are best friends. One is Jewish, one is not, one's Italian, and they have to face the brutality and severeness of the war as Italy is invaded by the Nazis and taken over. One woman in particular is the main character. She decides to take on this motherhood role of taking care of her best friend's son. There's also a very small, sweet romance subplot with an American soldier that I thought was well done. Again, not too much in the story, but added a little bit to for me at the end especially. And it's ultimately just a story of survival through the years of the war and everything that it takes out of you and away from you, but getting through it and making it through the other side, and also the potential lack of closure that there is for so many people that experienced that during the war, of just you don't know what happened to a lot of your loved ones, and a lot of records were erased or gone, and you just have no idea where people ended up as they were taken away by the Nazis. But I thought this one was so good. Highly recommend amongst all of the World War II historical fiction out there that exists. I haven't read all of it at all, but this one is definitely a standout and I think worth your time reading. I'll close out historical with one that surprised me at the very end that I read in December that I didn't expect to love as much as I did, and that is The Madwife by Megan Church. This is a gripping novel about a housewife in the 1950s that essentially is kind of losing her mind. She's dealing with postpartum, and we are in her head, in her thought life of the things that she's experiencing. She's a mom to a toddler, as well as dealing with the postpartum experience, her kind of strained or weird relationship with her husband, but maybe very common for that time period of not fully being connected or talking about everything that's on your mind, or the man just not understanding your role as a wife and a mother and what you could be feeling, and the different dynamics that she has with some of her neighbors and friends, and that kind of maybe frenemies relationship as well. But essentially we're in her mind, and some of the time we're thinking, what's going on? Is she actually losing her mind? And we're in her head as she's trying to figure that out herself. And I just thought it was so well done. It was so good. It definitely is not an easy read. It is infuriating. It was devastating, heartbreaking at so many times, and I'm just like, some jaw-dropping moments in the book for me. So I would check the trigger warnings, because it does have a lot of stuff that people do avoid, especially if you are a young mom, have dealt with really hard postpartum issues, infertility or child loss or any of that kind of stuff. This might not be for you because it's an intense read, and I didn't think it would be for me because I am a young mom that's dealt with some stuff, but I just thought it was so good. It was so well done, and I really liked how she wrote the story. So definitely be keeping an eye out on what this author comes out with next. And I think for an unhinged woman kind of story, I thought this stayed in the lane and was told really well. And I know a lot of these unhinged women stories or young motherhood stories go off the deep end, and I don't love to read about that because I don't think it always needs to go off the deep end. I don't think it always needs to be crazy. It could be realistic. So I appreciated that. Next, technically a contemporary book originally published in the 1980s is Voices in Summer by Rosamund Pilcher. Pilcher is an author that I read quite a few books from, and some were really big hits, several were really big misses, and most of her little shorter books have been misses, but this one was fantastic and honestly up there with Winter Solstice, and then this one comes in second, or maybe they're even tied. Winter Solstice is a very wintry, December, Christmassy read, and this is very much a summer set in the Cornwall kind of read. But I loved this short little story from Pilcher. It was, like I said, a great summer read. We follow a young woman who's newly married, and she's married to someone who has an ex, and she's kind of dealing with the fact that she's the second wife and maybe like doesn't fully fit in and doesn't know her place or her role, and like they love each other deeply, but she's unsure about things. But she decides to take up an invite to go visit some of his family that live in Cornwall, and she ends up falling in love with this English countryside and the people there. And there's also a mystery at play, which there has never really been a mystery in any of the Pilchers that I've read. There's some mystery, but it's usually just like family interpersonal drama. But this was an actual kind of mystery because you get an anonymous letter of someone accusing you of something that you didn't do. And so I just love that little aspect of things. I thoroughly enjoyed the relationships developing in this story. They felt more realistic than some of Pilcher's other books for me, and like I said, just very atmospheric in a nice way, because a lot of Pilcher's novels are more wintry, cold, kind of Scottish vibes, and this one was like south of England, summery loveliness. So that was really fun. Definitely one of her stronger books, I think. I can't make a favorites of 2025 video without talking about some of the fan fiction that I read this year, because I read a lot of Draco and Hermione Harry Potter fanfiction. The book that started it all was Manacled by Sin Lin Yu. A very dark, very intense read, but it blew my mind in the imagination of the original Harry Potter story and in who Draco and Hermione could be. Obviously, Harry Potter is the main character in the Harry Potter stories, but this just takes a spin on things, an alternate universe if Voldemort won the war instead of Harry Potter, and it goes very dark and very bleak, and the war is extended and a lot of terrible things happen. The author was inspired by Handmaid's Tale, and again, just very intense war drama, sexually explicit content, all of it. This book has all the trigger warnings, but again, I was so blown away by the expansiveness of the Harry Potter world in my mind from the original story that I enjoyed kind of contemplating and imagining a different situation, and I thought this was an incredibly satisfying conclusion as well, and a really just intense story along for the ride. It's a long one, but I thought it was so well done, and this book has been originally published since into Alchemized. I much prefer the Manacled version because again, I care about the Harry Potter world that I know and love a lot more than some random new fantasy world. This book started it all for me, and it wasn't a perfect read, and I don't see myself like rereading it ever, but again, it started this journey for me of, I don't know how many I read at this point, probably should have counted in 2025, but probably at least 10 Harry Potter fanfictions that I read, if not more. So that was a plus. But the one that tops it all, the book that I loved with my whole heart, that I think absolutely changed the way that I view Harry Potter series, similar to how I preferred Unequal Affection to the original Pride and Prejudice story, I kind of wish this book, The Disappearances of Draco Malfoy, was the last book. Like, instead of the Deathly Hallows being the Deathly Hallows, I wish this story existed instead. And I know that's a little hard to say for big Harry Potter fans out there, but that's how good this was. Obviously, again, Draco Malfoy becomes the main character, and he's really the standout voice, and it's his whole character arc, but this is written in the tone that the original author intended. Like, it's written in this kind of YA feel, these characters figuring things out. There is no explicitly sexual content, there's no language, like, it's written very similar in tone to the original books, but it just takes a spin on what if the moment that Dumbledore offered Draco refuge to come in and join the order, what if Draco said yes? So the story starts from there, but then it kind of still follows similar events. They're still hunting for the Horcruxes, they're still trying to figure out the Deathly Hallows, but Draco just joins Harry, Ron, and Hermione, and there is a very sweet, wholesome connection between Draco and Hermione that just makes sense in my mind, because I'm sorry, Ron and Hermione never made sense to me, absolutely not. So I was rooting for them, and this story was so well done, and it's actually written by an author. Even though it's fan fiction, it's written by someone who knows how to write. A lot of fan fiction is poorly written or overly written or not edited, and this one actually felt like a cohesive story, written really well, like edited well. It would never be a standalone book because it hinges on everything about the Harry Potter universe and the last kind of main events that need to happen for the story to unfold, but it was written so well done, and definitely a standout favorite read of the year. And I don't know if anyone is interested in me to make a whole Hermione video, but this would be the only one that I would strongly recommend to anyone that is a fan of Harry Potter and just wants to revisit that world with a different spin. I would say 99.9% of all of the other ones I would not recommend, because they're written for very specific reasons, and I would say it's not to dive into the Harry Potter world and be swept away from a different perspective. It's for porn, basically. So that's the sad thing, and I'm happy to report that this one is a gem, standout gem, shining bright diamond amongst a lot of garbage. And lastly, I'll end with a few honorable mentions in categories that I used to read a lot more of, but I haven't in 2025, and I hope to change that in the year to come. But sadly, as you can tell, I have no nonfiction favorites on this list, which is so heartbreaking because I used to read a lot more nonfiction, and that used to be such a stronger part of my reading life. But I think being a young mom in the headspace that I was swept up in, like, I just didn't want to read facts necessarily or be swept up in a long story. I was in my fiction world and in my romance world. The one nonfiction that I did read, I read quite a few parenting books, but the one that stood out is parenting book How to Talk So Little Kids Will Listen by Joanna Faber and Julie King. This is particularly for ages 2 to 7. My son is 2 and 3 months. So this I found very practical, very helpful. It's like very straightforward, and a lot of things in this book work, and I loved how it was laid out and written. Quite a bit of it is repetitive, but I think that's good in parenting books because sometimes you need reminders, or even just like the dialogue of like exactly how to phrase a sentence to try to get your kid to do something. I thought that this was super helpful, super practical, a great parenting book that stands out amongst a lot of the other ones that maybe are more like philosophy based or big theme based, versus this one is like actual things to do, actual steps to take, actual things to try with your kid to not make it be a big deal, to not make it be a big fight, to not make it be a big tantrum, but just get them to do what you want them to do in a fun way. Other types of books I used to read a lot more from is graphic novels, and sadly I just don't pick them up as often anymore. I don't read books physically as often anymore. Most of them are audiobooks or ebooks, and graphic novels tend to be the best in the physical format, obviously, so you can enjoy the beautiful artwork. But I absolutely loved and would strongly recommend Wildflower Emily, a story about young Emily Dickinson by Lydia Corey. This is technically a J or middle grade graphic novel, nonfiction graphic novel about Emily Dickinson, which I didn't know much about. I don't read too much poetry. I would love to dabble more here and there, but I just thought this was so cute, like a beautiful illustrated story of her life and how she wrote poems, the way that she went about the world and created her art. And I just loved some of the artwork in here. Was just so beautiful and so cute. Would strongly recommend for any young readers or adult readers that want to know more about Emily Dickinson. And I do read a lot of board books and picture books with my son. I started reading them several years ago just for fun as artwork, and I will just say the two standouts for me in 2025. The Little Blue Cottage by Kelly Jordan. This is a very sweet book that is very reminiscent of the art style of Sylvie Blackhall, which is one of my favorite illustrators, and this book felt like the Farmhouse book that is one of my favorites by her. It's about a little blue house and the people that come visit it over the years and how it changes and the scenery, and it's a very sweet story with beautiful illustrations. I also loved The Barn and the illustrator Barry Root. This is written by Leah H. Rogers. I loved the color palette of this illustrator and just some of the storytelling with this barn. I love the deep colors and the warm tones of his illustration. So this was also another standout picture book of the year. And that wraps it up. Those are some of my favorite reads that I got to in the year of 2025. Let me know if any of these sound good to you, or if you've read them as well or are now on your radar. And also let me know what your top favorite book that you read last year was, because I am doing a little bit of a project. We'll see what happens with it and see if it comes to fruition, but I would love your recommendations or just any of your thoughts on some of your favorite reads as well. Would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching and spending some time today with me, and I will see you guys in another video soon. Bye.